Welcome to our meetup. Sorry for the bit of a long hiatus. I've been away, and then I've also been like super busy at school. But we're back. So I think we've got Brian presenting on the future of work, and then I'll be giving a quick recap of DevCon4. So without further ado, let's get started.
Thank you. Awesome. So I want to talk about how blockchain is changing, in my eyes, some of the signals that it's changing the way in which we will do work, the way in which we'll collaborate, the way in which businesses will operate and function, form, dissolve, attract talent, that type of thing. So that's the conversation topic for today. I'm going to present some opinions and some thoughts on this, and I think it's important to kind of just describe what I know or don't know, probably more so don't know, by just describing my background. So I'm a mechanical engineer, graduated in 2005 here at University of Waterloo. Yeah, I did the pure sort of mechanical thing, designing passenger rail vehicles, so suspension systems, dynamics, doing finite element analysis of some of the structural components. It's a long way back for me now, and I've forgotten most of it. But the lack of innovation in the sort of rail industry, I was with a small consulting firm. It was a lot of fun. We used to call ourselves Ghostbusters for trains. I started to get more involved with the clients and the client-facing side of things, so like trying to understand requirements and mediation in scenarios between governments and vendors. And so I started to really get into this idea of like how businesses operate together. Plus I was consulting at the time, so I was actually flying into like new businesses every week sometimes and like getting a flavor for how they organize themselves, do a project, like the business culture. And I started to really realize how much of an impact this whole, how you choose to organize, how you collaborate, your business practices, processes, just like the behaviors and attitudes and some of the cultural norms within a team could really shift things. Was fascinated by that, but lack of innovation, as I said, in the rail industry is constrained by a number of things, lobbyist groups within the US, as well as the Code of Federal Regulations and the amount of constraints. So it's not a technological problem, it's actually a regulatory problem. I started to get bored. So I found my vision in town and was there for about 6 years. Made the jump over to high tech. I found a role that I fell in love with. It was called product management. I didn't really know what it was. I was writing a whole bunch of like business cases on weekends because I thought I was going to be an entrepreneur, scaring the crap out of my then wife, who had gone out to be an entrepreneur of her own. And so I was inspired by that. And she said, well, no, we can't have two of us in the house. So I went to my vision, found this product management thing, which was effectively like, you know, a lot of things I enjoy doing, thinking about go-to-market strategy, business strategy, product strategy, technologies, the intersection of design, tech, business, basically. So at my vision, I also got exposed to a startup. So 6 years there as it was scaling and growing. It's a local company, one of the first accelerator graduates in the accelerator center here in town, and they've grown quite nicely. And so over those years, I rotated through a lot of teams. So this is a pattern again. I don't really kind of stay in one spot too long. And had a chance to watch what it's like as a team sort of grows up from 30 to 100, 150 people, and some of the challenges that happen as you open up additional offices across the globe, and you're that high-tech, agile, fast-paced, startup, scrappy environment, and the challenges of traditional business structures, in particular the concept of like when we brought in managers and brought in hierarchy, how much it slowed us down, but how when we tried to strip it out, we ended up with challenges around communication, coordination, and so it was sort of like, do we centralize power into managers, even though that feels weird, or do we trend towards chaos? And so in 2016, a colleague and I started thinking a lot about alternative methods of organization. Basically, what does agile at scale look like? How could teams stay flat, or all these buzzwords that are basically out there, be more managerless, self-managing, self-organizing. And this went down a rabbit hole that really got into the self-management, self-organizing, self-governance space within business. And we eventually ended up winding down this project, the Teal software project. It was a spin-out that we were working on. My colleague and I left that, and we had stumbled into the blockchain at that point in time. and met some companies that were working on things like decentralized governance. And we were fascinated by what we were seeing in this space, and I'll get into that more. So now I'm with Consensus. We've been there about a year. This is the project that more recently was announced that I've had the opportunity to work on while at Consensus. And Consensus was quite a fascinating organization in that when we joined, there were only about 200 people globally. They're now 1,200. That's only 12 months later. And they have sort of a exponential growth pattern. It's a venture studio group for the Ethereum blockchain, for those who don't know. So effectively, there are tons and tons of Ethereum-based startups that are incubating under Consensus, and there aren't any report lines. So for those 1,200 people, they've basically scaled up without a traditional management structure. And so that was kind of fascinating, and we were lucky enough to be able to come in and learn what kinds of tools they were trying to build to support that. So had the joy of working on Sobel, which was just announced at DevCon by Joe Lubin, and we're like really, really early stage, sort of limited beta, but for the last 12 months, Consensus has effectively been our beta customers. We went from the 200 to 1,200 people. So watchsobel.io is bare bones landing page right now, but a little more about the project will be revealed, or I can talk afterwards about that. But that's not what I'm here to talk about today. It just explains what's inspired me, my path, and what started to influence some of these thoughts that I'm going to share today. So I think blockchain is going to accelerate a shift to more autonomous and self-managed work. I sort of hinted at that in my journey in sort of looking at agile methods and what can happen as you start to sort of scale that up. But sort of strip things back before I go into that statement of how I think those things are going to become, and say sort of like, what is a team? I mean, if we're saying that collectives of people are going to come together and they're going to do these more self-managed, self-governing, autonomous things, like less of a traditional bureaucracy and hierarchy, what is a team? Well, to me, I often think of teams as sort of a fusion, and this is a simplistic model because in truth they're just a crazy, complex, adaptive system of humans interacting, pursuing something together, or not, functionally or dysfunctionally. And so I really think it really starts with the drivers. A collective comes together because they're driven to do something together, and often at the base that can be purpose, mission. It can be broken down into goals. It can be broken down eventually into tasks. It's the thing that's kind of like creating a bit of an impulse on the team, and it starts back at this sort of visionary level of a change that we wish to manifest in the world. And so I realize that's a fairly simplistic macro level of things, and then I often think about a team as a collection. There's the people and their individual attributes, experiences, the lens in which they view the world. Then there's the habits, like the collective habits of the team. Sometimes people call that processes or working practices. But effectively, as a team starts to come together, it really starts to be more than just the individual collection of people. It starts to form collaborative habits or working practices, and then eventually it starts to involve tools in that to support those. And what's interesting about this whole system is, given that it is a complex adaptive system, and I realize again this is just a simplified sort of explanation of it, if you change any one of these things, be it the goal that you're trying to pursue, you substitute new DNA into the team, i.e. new people, or you do something to shift the habits, or change out the tools, you can actually see these areas influencing each other. And so the one I wanted to focus on today is actually what happens when you play around with the tools that the team is working with. I've always been really intrigued by Conway's law and Conway's corollary, which is the way teams organize themselves and communicate will trend towards matching the tools that they work with and the systems that they're building. And so coming back on my history, the thing that was really fascinating for me was I was in pursuit of organizations that didn't have traditional hierarchy or traditional bureaucratic methods. And traditional org structures of you report to the boss and the boss reports to the boss kind of thing. And I found this pattern that blockchain companies there was a large number of them, and I knew nothing about blockchain at the time, were organizing in these self-governing, self-organizing ways, these network-like organizations, which were these structures that, these, what some people were referring to as hippies were thinking of. And it was really interesting to see these hardcore, fast-growing technology companies doing exactly this. And, I started to see the pattern of Conway's Law, that in effect, they were working with tools where, there were nodes, in this case, computing nodes, across the globe, distributed and coming together on a protocol to make decisions, in this case about, a block and whether it should be in the blockchain. But, and in effect, this was starting to influence the behaviors, the philosophies, the organizing desires and practices of the people who were working with these tools. And this isn't the first time this has happened. It was always really interesting to watch software teams and how they organize. Microservices architecture, and you start to see that the teams are starting to almost behave like microservices with each other in the way that they communicate, the way in which they collaborate, the way in which they deliver. Talked to someone recently who was a product manager at Uber. He was saying, we effectively ship our org chart, was the way he liked to phrase it, and others do. And so I think this is a really interesting effect, and I wanted to explore today that this pattern, I'm observing it in the blockchain space as well. I also want to talk about when technology has a tendency to create a pretty substantial shift in the way in which we work. We've already seen this happen once, I'd argue. I think there's a direct link between the birth of the internet and agile software development, and basically, the transition from typical project management, like waterfall project management, that was used to build really complex industrial revolution things, all the way up to like space travel, right? It started to kind of fall down as people were doing these iterative software projects. The manifesto comes along and basically says, hey, we've got new tools that we're working with here. This software development, and particularly this web development as it was coming in. We got to rethink how we organize and how we build. And it was interesting to see how the technologies that teams were working with started to really influence a pretty substantial shift in the way in which we collaborate and deliver projects. And I think, what's now almost like 20 years later, maybe almost 30, we kind of take this for granted, particularly those who have, the agile was always the way that we did software development. But there's this interesting pattern too. So yeah, these technologies created this shift. The other thing that's an interesting pattern is at first, when we're experimenting with new methods of working, we tend to effectively write protocols of how we're going to work. And some of the early protocols can sometimes be a little bit rigid or a little bit dogmatic, but they're a first pass. Extreme programming, for those who might be familiar with it, it's a fairly interesting one. Basically at the end of your sprint, you're junking the code if it's not complete, and you have to start from scratch in the next sprint. There's some other fairly interesting sort of rules around how some people approach this, but at the end of the day, we fast forward to where we are today, and for those of you who've had the opportunity to hang out in agile teams, you don't really follow a particular protocol. The DNA of what agile is as a practice or a process has been so mutated over the years that each team kind of comes in with their own sense of what this project's going to be like, or this particular piece of architecture we're working on and how we want to deliver. And the end result is that sort of the experiences of the folks who have done agile before ends up with this sort of each team has their own sort of flavor, but you can see sort of some pillars to how it's done. And so, and the other interesting thing across this has been the way the tools that support this practice have shifted. They were kind of dogmatic in the early days, but then over time, they become a little more generalized and flexible to this mutation. So, Jira's, the Trello's, the GitHub's, you can configure these to kind of pull off all the different working methods that you might, the particular variant that is your team's. And so, one of the things that I'm sort of noticing, and this visualization kind of helped me think about it, is the sort of the S-curves of innovation. And I think that what's happening here, if we were to say this first curve is sort of the Web 2 and the second curve is Web 3, I think that, you know, we're in this spot where there's another pretty substantial shift in the way in which we work that's going to emerge, and it won't be just those who develop on top of these tools, because that's the thing about Agile, is it started as something that, you know, software teams were doing, but I have, within the last 3 years, met marketing teams, HR teams, all kinds of teams across the business, entire teams that are effectively using Agile principles in their delivery, and even 2 years ago started to see some sales teams that were running like sprints, and some tools that were emerging to go over top of Salesforce for these sort of interesting players. So, I mean, that to me is almost like the maturity of this new method of working, and it's also kind of matching the maturity of the Web 2 sort of phase. I think there's this new one coming, and I think with it are some pretty substantial changes. So
I have a question.
Yeah, sure.
That previous slide.
Yes.
You have an arrow that goes like upside down. Is that the hype curve, or?
Yeah, I mean, no, it's not necessarily the hype curve, but there are also hype curves, you know, that could be drawn, overlaid on these types of curves if you wanted. I mean, the problem with these constructs is they're kind of like, they're simplified ways of viewing a concept and asking yourself whether, you know, this matches what we're experiencing. I mean, height curves, S curves, etc. You never really know truly where you are in the curve. The arrow flipping is kind of simply to state that as the one cycle is just reaching maturity, the next cycle is incubated, and you know you're feeling a tension on that maturing system and a bit of a transition. Probably, if you want to play the game of all these models, not unlike Geoffrey Moore's or the like adoption curve / you know, the hype cycle curve, probably all simultaneously occurring in this zone of transition. Yeah, I don't know if the theory doesn't matter too much, because where we are on the curve is debatable. If we're even on the curve is debatable, but yeah. So I think I'm not going to describe, you know, what blockchain is to this group, because I think everybody understands some sense of the technology, and then, you know, what's happening on some of the layer 2 sides of things. So I wanted to talk a little bit about sort of the elements of this and the signals in the space, that there are some aspects of how we work that are changing, as I described. I think one in particular is this concept of like work distribution, collaboration, and rewards. And I often kind of think of it as almost like an unbundling of work. Like, it seems like the majority of our options in terms of doing work up until the last 10 years or so were, you know, you get a job, or you're the person who starts the business, you know, and so you're either freelancing or you've got a job. Now, I realize that's a bit of a simplification, and then, you know, some of the you know, the gig economy starts to sort of rise, but one of the things I said off the start of this is that I don't think that any one of these trends is being driven by blockchain. I think that it's actually capable of acting as a bit of an accelerant to some of these things. And so we were already seeing some hints that work was getting, you know, sort of unbundled. And then I think, you know, with blockchain, you're starting to bring rewards, like extrinsic rewards into the picture, and a little more flexibility around that, so that it's not just transacting fiat. Some of these projects, whether it's these bounty systems like bounties and Gitcoin, are transacting tokens that are representative of having a stake in the project and its successes, or a stake in you know, being able to vote on the direction of that project. And so, yeah, it looks like just a simple gig, you know, sort of economy where, you know, you've got the Elance Upwork type thing happening. But I think when you start to tie in the flexibility that tokenization is bringing around rewards, you can get some pretty interesting things happening. And so Quiddly was one example that I found kind of interesting, which is effectively like a really dynamic cap table. So Quiddly basically allows you to tokenize your cap table, and then have people participating in the project, and sort of slicing of the pie style, for those who might be familiar with it. It's kind of like a dynamic slicing of the equity as you're going, and Quigley is basically setting up an application that helps you do this, in a tokenized way. Colony seems to be like a hybrid, where if I was to think of work distribution in sort of three-ish patterns, you've got sort of that traditional long-term, open-ended sort of employment. Please come here, fulfill this role, and the rewards will be commensurate, with X, whether that's equity or compensation. It's kind of like traditional employment, or a retainer if you're a subcontractor. There's this kind of this projectized method. The movie industry is a great example of this, where people often might work on the same film together and then work on the next one together. And there are definite roles associated with what it takes to pull off a movie: the actor, the key grip, the set designer, etc. And then they come together though for a finite period of time, have negotiated doing rewards around that particular event, and then they disband and then they go to the next one. And they build reputation and they carry it over. I think that there are other types of industries where this would have been possible, and with the some of these digital tools and the ability to form contracts, quickly and readily, you might be able to see more of this crowd type thing. And I think Colony.io has been thinking similarly. They almost basically set a protocol, from what I've seen in some of their demos, that allows a Kanban board or a backlog, a project backlog, to be worked with rewards tied to the individual tasks. So being key grip, on this movie today would equal X, actor, this. And so Colony, though, sets it up so you could basically pull a groomed backlog of bounties on a project for a finite period of time and receive rewards. And some of these other ones, like Oculus and A-Worker, are fairly interesting, as they start to play with this concept of how would you set up reputation, how would you set up a more global and transient sort of marketplace for work, such that you would feel a little more borderless, and you could feel a little bit like a freelancer, but maybe have a lot of the types of rewards that typically only employed people have, like a benefits package and and these types of things. So it just looks like there's a lot of blurring of the lines that's going to start to occur, and these are some of the really early stage applications that are starting to play with, how does work get distributed, how do we collaborate, how do we dispense rewards, and how do we not necessarily have to play from all of the, constrained by all the templates that we were using historically. And I imagine that with this, there's the possibility for a very global and liquid talent market, where one of the challenges when you talk to people about wanting to go freelance, have more autonomy, more control, is there is a fear of being able to have access to work. One of the things that scares most people to going out on their own is well, if I'm freelancing, will I be able to get enough work, or will I starve? If I have to go and build my own application, am I going to be able to raise capital? Am I going to be able to put food on the table, or am I eating ramen? I think that one of the things that's missing is that sort of liquidity, whether it's capital flowing into projects, or whether in this case it's talent being able to move around comfortably and freely and find work that's in alignment with their passions and skills. And I think as we go to these more remote global workforces, the only thing that seems to be a barrier is this concept of which country you're employed in. Our state nations and our borders start to become a bit of a challenge, but for us as workers, we're perfectly comfortable joining. I think we would be more comfortable being an individual agent if we had the ability to sort of move around to all these different opportunities and had contracts that facilitated this as well. So I think that's something that's brewing here. The other is governance and organization. So one of the other things that some of the thought leaders around self-organizing teams. So what happens when you rip managers out? One of the researchers who was on the forefront of that was Frederick Laloux. The book is Reinventing Organizations. I had a chance to meet him in Ithaca a couple weeks back and have a chat with him, and He did sort of an anthropological study of human organizational systems, and then did some case studies around teams that had pulled out, traditional management and what was it they were doing instead. And some of them were really, really large global teams. And there were sort of these pillars of things they had to figure out how to do that managers used to do, or the traditional sort of hierarchy did for them. And one of them was, many of them actually revolve around decision making, like hiring and firing, compensation and rewards, which we kind of touched on a little bit on the other slide, or decisions around resource distribution, so which projects should be funded, which shouldn't, and many other sort of decisions. What should we build? What should we not build? And so I think there's some interesting governance mechanics that are emerging within the blockchain space that are allowing this to happen at scale. And that's sort of one of the things that Frederick Laloux started to notice, is that many of these were smaller organizations, some of them larger, but they ended up having to kind of like culturally create protocols and like really codify them, and then like culturally embed them in their organizations to sort of get away with not retreating to sort of their own ways of doing things. But these things are actually really cool. DAOs, token curated registration lists, and prediction markets are sort of a more scalable way to pull off governance on some pretty sticky issues, and have traceability around, how was this hiring decision made, how was this firing decision made, how are rewards being distributed, is severance being paid. I think it's basically, it's possible to imagine sort of a cooperation, a sort of corporation of cooperation that's governed by these smart contracts, and many of the different use cases I've seen have been explored. Saw a cool demo recently of an employment agreement that was paying out salary as well as equity, all using smart contracts. So that seems, kind of like an interesting experiment, but it kind of hit home for me as somebody who had to navigate employment law on the back end of being let go, and bringing in employment lawyers to try and figure out how to handle something that seemed like it was supposed to be clear-cut within a contractual agreement. When code is law on something as simple as an employment agreement, I think you can get some pretty interesting things happening. As well as on the governance side, I think there's a lot of experiments that need to be had. They don't necessarily need to be tokenized experiments at first, but trying to understand how teams would make decisions and how they do it effectively for a lot of those different scenarios, like how do you decide which projects we should be working on. I saw some interesting cases recently around a legal team trying to make decisions around how a case should progress and risk associated with it, which is human assessed. And they were starting to see some merits to running effectively a prediction market around the various stages of case law and making decisions based on experts and rewarding those experts for the risk assessment of an active case. And so a lot of decisions that need to be made in business, and I think many of these have been quite fascinating to look at. I'm not going to look into any one of them, but yeah, I'd say the combination of sort of liquid democracy and delegated votes and token curated registries in particular has caught my interest.
I have another question here.
Yeah.
So governments means also deciding what project to work on. Is that decided by blockchain, or some guy that says, I have this money, I have this problem to solve, and then you use the blockchain to govern the development, but the decision to what to work on is driven by blockchain or not?
Yeah, so here, I'll give you an example. I'll try to make this more concrete, and if I haven't at any point, because I can sometimes talk a little bit at the 10,000 foot, and I apologize if some of this sounds complexity, so I'll give a concrete example. So on resource distribution, deciding what projects to work on, I've actually seen teams do this without blockchain, but if you were doing it at a pretty substantial scale or with a pretty substantial amount of money, I think you'd want to start to incorporate a ledger-based technology. But teams were distributing tokens, and they were not blockchain backed, but they were just like, it was a tokenized experiment. And this was in the self-governance space, where they were effectively co-budgeting. So instead of a traditional budgeting process, which is basically teams submit the request, managers aggregate, executive committee sits around and then decides and then ratifies with board of directors. But usually the executive team knows how much they would like to spend, sort of at a macro level. There's a guidance piece that went out first. This basically says tokenize the guidance, distribute the amount of salary and non-salary spend, so run rate and variable that you're willing to throw into to the system, and actually give it to the crowd, and then start to create an internal Kickstarter campaign type initiative to forming budgets and budget initiatives, such that you've got a sort of dynamic nature to proposal and funding proposals. Another thing I've seen that's a little less grand scale than that was within an engineering team, a practice where they tokenized the man hours approximately that they had to give, and worked a proposal and funding system that was crowd-funded by the team. And so they're effectively making, sort of that wise crowd's decision around what should be funded and what shouldn't, and creating a mechanism for putting forward a proposal. So that would be an example of that. I hope did that answer your question, or set some ideas?
Yeah, I was wondering, it is fair to say that this is still immature? Because I understand that Ethereum itself has an issue with self-governance in the development of the blockchain itself.
I think the whole thing is immature. Like, so if we were to come back, I mean, I think that we're still in this like really, really early phase. And so, as I said, I don't really want to point anywhere on these curves because it's all, like ridiculous to try and point on a spot on that curve. But I think I just argue personally that a lot of these tensions and these shifts were already emerging before this technology even came forward. So, and it was basically sort of an extension of Web 2 / the new agile working practices and startup cultures and funding cultures. I feel like we're just in this early phase of starting to figure out what's the next phase shift on this, and it was happening long before these technologies showed up. And I think that what's happening is these technologies are in a position to start experimenting, figure out what's going to work and what's not going to work. Because if we go back to here, I don't see very many people talking about RAD, UP, or I just today saw one team talking about how they were going to use XP. But these really, really early stage inceptions of the behaviors and the human protocols, and then the tools come kind of in parallel. Because around these early times as well, the Jira's was just a ticketing system and was kind of playing into this a little bit. And the Trello was, we saw the teams like this typically use sticky notes on a whiteboard, and the Fogbugs guys, if I'm recalling correctly, or somebody related to that team, ended up doing Trello. So I think what's happening is these people who are working in this new space with this new technology are realizing that they too are shifting the way that they're going to work, and they're starting to play with these. So yeah, infancy. I think it's absolute infancy, and I'm not even sure that all of these methods will end up being used in corporate business and project-based governance. We might find that everything, that all decisions should be made using a liquid democracy, and that's always what you use inside of a business. But I like to believe that it's actually going to be an intriguing fusion where different types of decisions that are made will be made using different mechanics.
I know these projects are using kind of voting mechanism to decide in the governments, to decide the project to work on, because I know, for example, Cardano blockchain, they are proud that they're implementing self-governance through the blockchain, voting mechanism to decide what project to allocate the funds.
Yeah.
I was wondering in the Ethereum space if, because I'm ignorant in this area.
I mean, the closest thing I've seen is CIPs sometimes get votes that, EIPs, my apology. EIPs sometimes have straw poll votes that are using Ethereum sort of token hold. So it's like a plutocracy vote. It's a simple sort of signal. I recall seeing that, was it early this year? And I apologize guys, I don't really follow too closely, but I think one of my concerns is that like when you mix too many things together simultaneously, you've got an infant technology, you're trying to also simultaneously do a governance system, and you're simultaneously like, that does seem a little concerning, because if you've got any one of those wrong, you're technically jeopardizing your project. So I think those that have the grand vision and are attempting to do the all-in-one, my natural personal reaction to that is that's a little concerning, because you're experimenting with too many things simultaneously, and you're hardening them, because when you start to create protocols and deploy stuff to smart contracts, yeah, they're iterative, but it's not like near as iterative as like people playing around with a spreadsheet or pen and paper, or sticky notes or Web 2 throwaway hacky app that doesn't vote. So I think we need a lot to learn from a human perspective, and that we'll end up learning these as these technologies figure out how to harden themselves, become interoperable, scale. All of that seems to be a pretty dominant conversation. I think that I'm more fascinated not by that element, but this other element that I'm seeing that's happening in parallel, which is the behavioral shift, and the fact that blockchain is starting to help unlock some of these things that were thought of in a theoretical sense, for hundreds of years in some cases. Many of the ones that I've been resonating on were first started dialogue around the 60s, 70s, and like I said, they were called a bunch of hippies who weren't interested in business, but the hilarious part is now I think some of these things could be realized and at scale. So yeah, and I think to this last thing of like resource distribution and capital, I think there's kind of like already some examples. I mentioned the co-budgeting, the internal funding, and then we saw like billions in latent capital released. There was a relatively minimal barrier to entry. People who had good ideas, people who had capital, even if that was me just playing around with a little bit of, fiat that I converted to ETH that I then started to play in the market. What was really happening here was like a massive innovation acceleration. I realized that much to the chagrin of the legal system that hadn't quite caught up yet, and there's still a lot of that happening in the news these days around that. But I feel as though that's what's happening on a micro scale, but I'm also seeing these experiments that, as I mentioned, on a more that's on a macro scale, on a more micro scale within businesses. These co-budgeting techniques, these crowdfunding techniques. Businesses may not look like businesses as they are today. One of the things I've been inspired by at Consensus is the fact that it doesn't even really look like a traditional corporation. It actually just looks like a collective or a hive or a community. I don't know how to describe it any other way other than that it is like a pool of capital and a pool of human capital and talent that is quite liquid in nature. So, which projects are funded and which ones aren't, and where people tend to move is not constrained by geographic boundaries, it's not constrained by traditional employment agreements and golden handcuffs and stock option holdbacks to which you will claw in talent. I mean, effectively, you've got a community of startups, companies, and alumni now, all collaborating, and far more interoperable in the sense of human collaboration than I've seen in traditional systems. And I think that's going to happen more and more. Venture capitalists, they've already been signaling this a little bit. VC portfolios have a tendency to get their portfolio companies together and sharing and working together a little bit more. It's never quite all the way there, but you can see that they had the right idea. It was like, well, if we have a pool of capital and it's directed against, sometimes VCs have these like very directed initiatives, like we're going to go with the medtech space. And we get a portfolio of medtech companies underneath, and it's like trying to get them to collaborate, cooperate. I've seen private equity firms that hold these kinds of strategies and are trying to create something that's bigger than just the sum of the parts. And I feel like blockchain has the possibility of doing that on a much grander scale and much more dynamically, less with one person or persons coming together and having to, in a centralized way, say we're going to do this. Much more decentralized mechanics and organic mechanics could emerge. So that's kind of the thing that I was hoping to present. I apologize if I went a little on the longer side, but yeah, Conway's Law is what's inspired a lot of my observations, and yeah, the way the team organizes is going to start to tend to match the tools we work with. And I think blockchain is a pretty, or distributed ledger technology, or whatever you want to call it these days, is a pretty fascinating shift, and will impact us. Thank you. I appreciated there were some questions along the way. I don't know if there's any other questions that were percolating as we went through.
I think I can make a comment that I was seeing some headlines recently where they were saying in the future the work, it doesn't equal with jobs because of the artificial intelligence and mass unemployment that will come with all the people that will be displaced. So you can use blockchain, the same technology you use right now, blockchain, for people to find work like a job. You can use it to find work like a passion, or like social or community-driven projects, something like that. So.
Yeah, I mean, it's interesting. So if I'm understanding correctly, you're basically calling attention to the fact that there is a bit of this sort of AI displacement thing. One would argue that technology displacement to human jobs has been a thing since the Industrial Revolution really kind of kicked off. And it's just accelerating. Yeah, I think another way of thinking of it is simply like, what I'm talking about here is human collaboration and the transaction of value, where that value might be, services that I deliver, and then I'm transacting for rewards that match, whether that's reputation, like my interests. What am I going for? Reputation, stake in a company, fiat-ish type, like, compensation, which is, transactable, whether it's US dollar or DAI or whatever. I think really it just comes down to what motivates me and what kind of reward am I seeking. Is it power? Am I interested in having voting rights? Am I interested? These are a lot of things that a lot of traditional entrepreneurs have to think about, and I think more and more we're going to each have to think about as individuals. What is it we're pursuing, and what value are we bringing to the world in exchange? What do we value in return? And I think there's going to be an interesting sort of, kid in a candy store experience for all of us. But I'm one of those people who subscribes to the utopia sort of thought on that. So thank you. It's a good question. Anyone else? No? Thanks. Thanks for humoring me and let me talk about something a little bit.